Hi, this is Mike Medeiros, and you're listening to EmBed, the podcast recorded in Emily Dickinson's bedroom at the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, Massachusetts. Today we're talking with Lawrence Hott of Florentine Films' Hott Productions, whose latest film is Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America. Larry, why don't you tell us a little bit about the film?
This is a one-hour film for PBS. It'll be on June 20th. And this is a film we've been working on for 5 years, but I've been working on this film for maybe 35 years. Because I first got interested in Olmsted when I was working on a film about the Quabbin Reservoir and water supply issues in Massachusetts. And I was doing a lot of research and scouting in Boston about the water supply there. And if you do that, you just tumble over Olmsted. You can't avoid him. He's famous in Boston for creating the Emerald Necklace, a series of parks and bike paths and trails around Boston. But he really got his start in Boston working on the Back Bay Fens, which was an environmental project, a reclamation project, the first of its kind in the United States. It took a polluted salt marsh, which was a sewer for Boston, and turned it into a beautiful park. And I thought, well, Olmsted's an interesting character. One day I'd like to do a film on him. So then 35 years later, I did.
There's a tendency with Olmsted that there's an ownership from a lot of people, and that George Washington slept here kind of.
Yeah, everybody wants to claim Olmsted. In fact, when we had the idea for the film, I took it to the people at WNED TV in Buffalo, the PBS station, and they said, "Well, we've had that idea because Olmsted's really important to Buffalo. He did the first integrated park system, a coordinated park system of parkways and parks in the country there." And that was lucky. We knew that. That's why I went to Buffalo with it. And they're the ones who put together the fundraising package so that we could make the film. And also right here in this area, the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, now known as Mass Humanities, put some of the initial money in so we can get started because Olmsted is incredibly important in Massachusetts.
And he's very important to some of the tradition of the Dickinson Museum as well. There are stories told of Frederick Law Olmsted visiting the Dickinson property in 1874 when he was in town. And he'd been involved at Amherst College in 1870. You have some interesting anecdotes about that.
When I was looking into what Olmsted did in the area, I came across his correspondence with William Stearns, who was the president of Amherst College in the 1870s. And Olmsted, in its typical Olmstedian fashion, didn't hold back when he criticized the way the college was being built. It had already existed for a while. This is some of his this is verbatim from his letter to Stearns, April 5th, 1870. Looking ahead at all beyond our own time, the old range of brick buildings is, except for historical associations, extremely uninteresting and of little value. Now I'll skip down to the next paragraph. The remedy is to be found by freeing the mind from the associations established by circumstances, which have been superseded. Disencumber your plans from regard to the few buildings, comparatively unimportant with reference to the future, which awkwardly dovetail it to the village. Cut loose from the village altogether, as well as the Connecticut River, and build the college up by itself upon a center of its own. This is typical Olmsted. He's saying, look to the future. And what he did in cities and towns and all his projects is he said, you're being very small-minded if you think about just today. He's got a famous quote. He says, nothing we do in a park is designed for now. We have to look 40 years into the future. And he had a hard time. I think landscape architects generally do have a hard time convincing their clients to wait 20, 30, 40 years to see what things are going to look like.
You co-produced the film with your wife, Diane Gary. What was the process like for the two of you starting off with this? What kind of research did you have to do, and what kind of surprises were there along the way?
Well, Diane and I have been producing films together since 1978. So there weren't too many surprises in the way we worked together. We call ourselves designated fighting partners. But we knew from the beginning that this was a huge archival process. We work with a guy named Rich Remsburg, who's an archival expert. He lives in North Adams. We bring him in right from the beginning. We've learned our lesson on this. We had a lot of experience researching archives ourselves, but the internet has changed the way research is done, and it's helpful to work with a professional who also has contacts with the people who own the collections. So there's the usual suspects. There's the National Archives and the Library of Congress, and then in this case, the National Park Service, because they own and run Fairstead, which is Olmsted's home in Brookline, Massachusetts. They have a massive archive there. So we knew where to begin. And unlike a lot of our films, there wasn't a lot of motion picture archives. One of the things we like about producing certain types of 19th century history films is if they're landscape-based, then you have something to show. It's very difficult to do a biography of somebody who was born before the age of photography, as Olmsted was. Although he lived deep into the age of photography, there's only 6, 7, 8 really decent photographs of Olmsted. And in fact, in the film, one of our interviewees describes there's the Civil War Olmsted, and then there's the Santa Claus Olmsted, the famous picture of him with the beard. But there's not that many photographs of him. It reminded me of a film we did on John James Audubon, with same exact time period, and we were lucky because if we ran out of photographs of Audubon, of which only 1 or 2, then you could cut to the bird, or you can cut to the landscapes he worked in. Well, same with Olmsted. With Olmsted, you're talking about the vision, the images that he created. So we don't have to look at Olmsted himself. We look at what he created.
I know at the Emily Dickinson Museum, we deal with a lot of the myth of Emily Dickinson. And it seems like probably a lot of people have a myth about Frederick Law Olmsted. What was it like cutting through that and getting to the real person himself?
Well, like a lot of people, I only knew about Olmsted's parks and projects. I didn't know about Olmsted, the person. And when we got into his biography, we were really happy because he has a great backstory. He just didn't emerge fully formed as a mature landscape architect. In fact, he didn't really call himself a landscape architect until he was 42 years old, and the term landscape architect didn't exist. Even though there was, of course, landscape architecture, we had parks and we had houses, and there were plantings around houses, right? But the idea that it could be a profession, that's something that Olmsted invented. But before he even got to that, he failed at everything else he tried. But all that failure really prepared him to be a landscape architect. What I mean is that one of his first jobs was a surveyor. Well, you can imagine how important that is to a landscape architect. Then he traveled to China as a able seaman, and he almost died of scurvy. Then he tried scientific farming, which means he really understood the land. He was supported in all this by his father, who was a well-to-do merchant from Hartford. He let him take a break from farming to go travel around Europe with his brother and a friend. But when he was there in England, outside Liverpool, he saw one of the first public parks in the world, and this inspired him. So he didn't come running back to the United States and say, I'm going to be a landscape architect. He came running back to the United States and said, I need work. And because of his connections, he was familiar with the Transcendentalists. Familiar, I mean, he knew them. He knew Emerson and Thoreau. People knew him and his writings. And he got hired by the New York Times to be their first foreign correspondent. Except the foreign country was the South. And they sent him down there to report on the South. He ended up doing 40 or 50 articles, which eventually got turned into a book called The Cotton Kingdom. Interestingly, fast forward 120 years or so, and Malcolm X, when he's in prison, he writes in his autobiography that he was influenced by Olmsted's writing about the economics of slavery, right? Wow. So this is quite an influence that Olmsted has, a century later.
Shifting from Olmsted to yourself, how have you found your own creative process has changed in the years of filmmaking?
Well, now that I'm a mature veteran filmmaker, I start thinking about the story a lot earlier. A lot of times people will say, I have a great idea for you. And then you say, okay, but is there a narrative? Is there a beginning, middle, and end? So one thing I know is that if you have a biography, you've already, because biographies, that's a story right there. Somebody's born, they live an interesting life, one hopes, and then they die. And if you're lucky, they die a dramatic death. Olmsted, instead of dying a dramatic death, he dies a very kind of slow and sad, demented death. He's out of commission from 1895 to 1903 with dementia, so it's a long downhill slide for him. But what he does leave is this powerful legacy, not only in his children, his son and his stepson, but in a firm, a landscaping architecture firm that goes on until 1979. I mean, that's the modern era. So Olmsted really, really changes the way America looks, and that's another thing that I need in a film. It has to have some gravitas, to have some importance. Why invest 5 to 8 years on hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in a subject if it isn't going to have some meaning for the public?
Do you tend to film simultaneously several projects, or?
Yes, we try to have at least 3 projects going at a time. One in development, one in full production, and one finishing. And that's where we're at right now. So we've just finished the Olmsted film. And we really just did the final finishing work a couple of days ago. And we're deep in the middle of a film on the Lakota language, the Lakota Indian language, and the attempts to revitalize it. It's an endangered language film. Now, you might think there's no crossover with Olmsted, but there's plenty of crossovers with Olmsted.
How so?
Well, the big Lakota story and the American Indian story really overlaps exactly with Olmsted's lifetime. He's born in 1822, dies in 1903. Well, the 1820s is when things really get bad for the Lakota Indians and the Plains Indians. And in fact, the very last Indian battle in the United States is 1906. So there's a great overlap, but the most important thing to understand is how the Indians were romanticized. The romanticization coincides with the taming of the wilderness. Well, Olmsted, out in California working as a gold mining supervisor in the 1860s, is tapped to head up the commission on Yosemite. And Yosemite has an Indian tribe in it, right? But he's one of the people who looks at it as a place that needs to be preserved. He doesn't write much about the Indians that are there. But this idea of setting aside land, which Olmsted and several other people at the time are talking about, you can draw a direct line from that to the establishment of the Park Service and eventually even the passage of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the Wilderness Act in 1964. You cannot separate those things out from the way people perceived land and what we had lost when we took land from the Indians. All those things are jumbled up in the American mind. So Olmsted and the Lakota film that we're working on now are very much of a piece. And now we're starting a new film. We're looking at the youth in Springfield and the problems of how poverty affects their education and their safety. Well, what does Olmsted work on? He's an urban planner above all, right? People think of him as a landscape architect. But really what he's saying is, how do people live in a city? And how does the way a park or public space affect democracy? What does it do to the mind? And he's really a psychologist. So if you're looking at problems in a city, you're always looking at what the safety valves are. Where's the recreation? How do people relate to each other? How do they get around? Well, Olmsted, when he's designing parkways and connecting them to parks, he's thinking about these things way, way before anybody else is doing that. And so the idea of how do you get from one place to another? How much time is going to be spent? How do the classes mingle? That's very Olmstedian. And he was prescient. He was way ahead of everybody else.
Florentine Films, in many ways, has been ahead of everybody else in the documentary film world. What kind of collaborations do you have between the different groups that make it up?
Well, Florentine Films was one company back in the 70s, and we worked together for many years. And in the early 80s, we were sort of like a rock group where everybody wanted to be the lead singer, and everybody wanted to get the royalties, the profits from the work, according to what they thought they had put into it. But we were young, and we were still rather small, and we didn't have that many credits. And then rather than splitting up like most rock groups do, or small film companies, we consulted with a lawyer who had expertise in this, and we decided to create a consortium. It's sort of like a studio model, right? So under that model, there are 4 of the original owners. Each have their own company, and those companies are autonomous, completely autonomous. And at the time, it was really important for us to own the equipment together, and we had a vehicle, that was really important. So it wasn't very Olmstedian because we weren't thinking, 30 years down the line. But we decided that it was important for us to maintain this construct that we were one company. So like at that time, I had 3 films under my belt, but Florentine Films had 12 films together. So we would sell ourselves as a major company. And then years later, when Ken Burns got more famous with the Civil War series, we had to make a decision. Do we break off because it's confusing? And I had a public relations consultant who said to me, "What are you, nuts?" He said, "Florentine Films is one of the few brand names in documentary. Hold on to it. Just add your name to it. Make it Florentine Films Hott Productions." So that's good. The confusion works in our favor. So we've been Florentine Films Hott Productions for 25 years, and it's worked beautifully for us.
We're recording in Emily Dickinson's bedroom, which was her creative space, that she could get away from the world and write her poetry. Does having your own production company, is that kind of that creative space that gives you the ability to really go in your own directions and explore what you're interested in for the most part?
Well, you're taking me back to early in our history. In the 1970s, when Florentine Films was young, we had to make a decision about whether we were going to move to New York, move to LA, move to Miami, or move to the Third Coast, Texas, where all the film work was. And just at that time, FedEx started getting going and UPS overnight. And we could get our films that needed to be developed down to the New York City overnight. And it was long before the internet. But we thought, well, if we stay in this area where the rent is cheaper, and we can have a contact with the outdoors and do all the recreational things we want to do, we don't have to take on the commercial work we don't want to do, and we can concentrate on documentary. So in terms of that creative space, just living here allowed us to work on documentaries over the long term. It takes 3, 5, 8 years. Most of our films average 5 years. Many of them have taken 8 years. We don't always work at home. Over the years, I've had 15 offices. I've built offices onto my house. I bought 2 families and turned half of it into an office. I've been in some of the old factory buildings around here. And just 4 years ago, we finally bought a house in Florence, and Florentine Films is named for Florence, Mass., not Florence, Italy, because that's where we really got our beginning.
Too much.
And we bought a house in Florence that has an apartment we can rent out. It has a studio in it. It has a place for us to live. It's got a view. It's got some woods next to it, and that now is our perfect creative space. There are some disadvantages of working at home, as anybody who telecommutes will tell you. But the advantages are we are our own bosses, and that's very important for filmmaking because a lot of the time, a lot of filmmaking is not glamorous. A lot of it is either doing research, talking, thinking. When you're editing, it's very frustrating. You hit dead ends. You have to wait for people to come in and look at what you're doing to see if it's any good because you totally lose your perspective on it. Olmsted had that same problem, and he often fought against the authorities that didn't share his vision. He was a cantankerous guy. I don't feel like I'm a cantankerous person, not in the same way that Olmsted is, and I certainly don't think of myself as a genius, and Olmsted was.
How do you and Diane collaborate? Who takes the lead on certain roles? Who does what kind of in this job?
It's axiomatic to say that film is a collaboration, a collaborative effort, and it's absolutely true. There may be a couple of auteurs out there or somebody who can do everything, but they're so rare, and then their films aren't necessarily better. Over the now it's getting close to 40 years that Diane and I have worked together, we have really established a good working relationship. She is the editor, and I am the producer-director. But that doesn't mean that she doesn't do producing and directing. But I'm the one who's usually out in the field with the crew. But I bring the material back, and we look at it, and then she sends me out again and says, "Get something better, you bum." And then in the editing room, although I'm the director, she's the one who's actually had the hands-on work. She's actually more of the filmmaker than I am. She doesn't like the field work as much, and editing allows you to almost have a 9-to-5 schedule sometimes. She's become more technically adept than I am, but I'm more comfortable around the cameras and the crew and directing people. So it's an excellent collaboration.
How has technology changed over the years? Have you enjoyed the change as it's gone? Do you miss some of the older techniques? Or
That's an emotional question. Yeah. I very much miss 16 millimeter film. I came into film, it was a romantic thing to do. Two parts about it. One is you could actually, when you got that film exposed, you could actually pick it up and see it and hold it. And learning how to synchronize film and sound was a skill. And you couldn't break into film without having at least some of that skill. And also you had to raise more money early on. So you really had to vet your idea before you could even start. Now that's a double-edged sword. I'll come back to that in a second. But the other thing about film is in the actual process of filming with film. Film was so expensive, like $400 for 10 minutes, just to get it in your hands by the time you buy it, expose it, ship it, get it back, code it, and all that stuff, that an interview of, say, 6 rolls, an hour-long interview, you were in for $2,400 right there. Now, when you're doing that interview on video, it's pennies for that cost, but you pay for it in the end because you overshoot, and then you have too much material and you have to have it transcribed, so you don't save that much. But I think the process of film meant that you edited in your head before you even took a step out the door with your film crew, and I really miss that.
Do you find that younger filmmakers don't have that approach because it's so easy to just get that image and erase it? If it's
well, I haven't worked with enough younger filmmakers to know how they think when they're out in the field. I think that there's other things that have changed. I don't think younger filmmakers understand lighting the way that the camera people do who are old enough to have worked with film. I mean, film was a mystery. You had to really understand. You didn't see what you were going to get. You had to understand what tungsten film was going to look like if it lit a certain way, what daylight balance film was going to look like, indoor, outdoor, every possible speed of film. You really had to understand that. You can get into filmmaking now. You're more of an engineer, right? You have to understand the electronics more now than you did in the past. We really had to understand the play of light. The best cinematographers are the ones who still have who are old enough or were schooled in true filmmaking and understanding lighting. Even when you're outdoors and there's no light, they understand filters. They understand what can really be done. I miss that. I miss working with people who had enough experience to really understand light.
To return to the finished film, though, what's the schedule of release? When is it going to be out and available to the public?
The film will be out in a few weeks. It's going to be available through the PBS video website, for purchase. It'll be on PBS nationally on June 20th at 9 p.m. on a Friday night. That's a full national broadcast. Check your local listings because the local PBS stations don't always show it at the same time. There are, on the website, there are 6 other films that we've created. This originally was a 90-minute film, but PBS asked us to cut it down to 60. It's easier for them to program. So we took those 30 minutes and we created 25 minutes worth of films. One film is about, for example, the Louisville parks and the new park that's being built, a 4,000-acre park called 21st Century Parks, way outside Louisville, like an hour's drive outside Louisville. This is a very Olmstedian idea, not only in the way they've designed the park with its waterways and winding paths and hidden surprises, but Olmsted always told cities, you have to think literally outside the block. You have to go outside the city, buy the land where it's cheap, then you build it in your park, and then the property taxes of the houses around the park will help pay for the upkeep of the park. He was right and wrong about that. Yes, it will help pay for it, but it's not been enough. And that's why you see all around the country these park conservancies. Central Park Conservancy is the first and the most famous, $45 million annual budget. And the people who live around the park, who are very wealthy, that's their front yard. So they pay for it. The Prospect Park Alliance has a less wealthy clientele, but they still raise millions. And then there's the Louisville Park Conservancy, the Buffalo Park Conservancy, the Chicago Park Board. It goes on and on. So every city tries to have a public-private relationship to fund these parks. And it's the biggest issue in the park world now is funding the upkeep of these parks, the maintenance. Without it, you end up with an eyesore and a place that people don't want to go to. But with it, you end up with a city that's vibrant and healthier and safer.
Speaking of vibrant places, you'll be premiering it at the Academy of Music in Northampton. Is it important for you to have those ties to the local community to bring it to a place like that?
It's been really exciting for us to be local filmmakers with national films, major national films that we can premiere locally. This is the world premiere to have it here in Northampton at the Academy of Music, which is an iconic place, an absolutely beautiful place. We've had many of our premieres there. WGBY in Springfield is the sponsor. This is the third time they're sponsoring a major premiere of one of our films. I think they see the value in having local filmmakers producing on a national level as well as on a local level. So it's exciting for us to do that. It seats 800 people. We've sold out the last two. Well, it's free, but we fill the theater on the last two openings, and I think we will have a really good crowd this time. It's important for us to be able to share our work. You know, we used to have a lot more film events, but you know, with the DVD, even with the VCR and DVD revolution, you know, you can just send somebody a film. In the past, when you only had a 60mm print, you had to get people together, and then you could really see the impact. But there's nothing like seeing a film you worked on for years and years with a large audience. You know, so that whenever we can do that, we really want to pull it off. Well,
Larry, thanks for talking to this small audience in Emily Dickinson's bedroom. We appreciate hearing about your work and Frederick Law Olmsted's. I'll re-record.
Well, Mike, thanks for having me. It's really wonderful to be in Emily Dickinson's bedroom. I hope that she's listening, but I've listened to her for years, so it's a good meeting.
It's great. Yeah, one of the reasons why we're doing this is to bring in people we think Emily Dickinson would have liked to have met and talked with, and this definitely fits that.
Well, I don't know whether she would have liked to meet me, but I would love to have met her. So this has been a thrill. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Thank you.